this, and this is a kind of continuation of the last video I did. And then I talked about the fact that I didn't really like the Ultimate Fighter that much, and I had problems with it. And amazingly, there were people that agreed with me and actually wrote me and asked me to do a video on what I didn't like about it. And I thought this would be a pretty interesting video because most things I read, very few people complain about it, and I'm sure I'm in the very small minority of people that do have problems with the Ultimate Fighter. And maybe not. Maybe this can get maybe a discussion going. I don't know. But I shouldn't say I've never been a fan of it because I like the idea of it, and it has been successful in the sense that it is meant to create new stars, and it has definitely done that. There's no question about that. My problem with the Ultimate Fighter has to do with the fact of other things surrounding it. Those of you that don't know, the Ultimate Fighter is pretty much based almost. I mean, it's almost eerily how much it is like WWE's Tough Enough, which was they brought people in, taught them to be pro wrestlers, and then the winners. I'm still sick. Lumen signed them to a contract. The problem with the WWE's version was that none of them became big stars. Almost all of them flopped, and they were never. Some of them weren't even used properly when they were brought in, and it just was not a great idea. Even though I think that it would have been a good starting off point. And the Ultimate Fighter has done a better job of that, of guys getting shots of guys who were good, and there have been guys that have been in the Ultimate Fighter that have been good, going up the ranks and then kind of creating new stars. My problem really is the fact that kind of the aftermath sort of thing, where first of all I would say not the last few, but probably a lot of them, I've always felt like, you know, are we really getting the best up-and-coming non-UFC fighters? And I've never really thought that. I think there's definitely, and you can, if you, thanks to Inside MMA and Sherdog, and the fact that, you know, they do show a lot of smaller, they stream a lot of the smaller events, you can see a lot of fighters that you sit there and go, you know, they're maybe have only fought like 5 fights, and you're kind of like, wow, this guy looks like he would be pretty good, or that he would be somewhat marketable. I'm surprised that he's not, you know, part of the Ultimate Fighter. And there's lots of guys like that. Yeah, I don't watch the Ultimate Fighter enough to know, so I'm sure if I'm wrong, someone will point this out. But, you know, have any of the Ultimate Fighter guys been guys that have done good in the hook and shoot tournament? I mean, I'm just curious to know this. I'm curious to know if all they're doing is getting guys that are good for a reality show, and instead of going out and kind of scouting and looking for guys that would make good UFC fighters that maybe people have not heard of before. That's always been my problem, because we get these guys, these guys from the Ultimate Fighter, and they come in, and then almost all this happens. It seems like it happens a lot. Then they get these guys that have about the same record that come in, that when you research them, you find out it's probably better than the guy from the Ultimate Fighter. You know, they hype the Ultimate Fighter guy because he's the Ultimate Fighter, and then the other guy beats him. And someone on I brought this up on the last video I did when I was talking about this, and someone brought up the fact that, well, doesn't that help the guy that beat him because he beat a popular guy? And that's not always the case, because if you don't hype up the guy before he won, either it usually, because this happens in boxing a lot, it's like, well, you know, you didn't care, UFC didn't care enough about this guy to hype him up, and then because he was really expected to win to start with, the announcers usually don't make it sound like an upset, so there's no reason for the fans to really care about it. You know, you got to make the fans care about it. Either say, ooh, this is somewhat of an upset, or, you know, have him brought in and says, oh, you know, this guy wasn't in the Ultimate Fighter, but he's probably the better of the two fighters. Hype him up a little bit, make people seem like the guy's somewhat important, and or it really doesn't work. It doesn't play off well, and that's happened, I think, far too often like I said, there's guys that, you know, come in that you're like, well, why wasn't he on there? And part of that is there's guys that just don't want to be part of the Ultimate Fighter because they don't want to, you know, they'd rather be out fighting, or they'd rather be out doing other things than being part of it. And like I said, you also have the reality show aspect of it, which I think is the problem as well. And I would say probably the last 3 seasons, in my opinion, the show has started to get a little stale. And then, you know, you've just got a couple of knuckleheads that they bring in that make it entertaining. And if it wasn't for that, they're you know, it's kind of like, oh, who really cares? You know, and this season, I think UFC has kind of backed themselves in a corner because the way that they have dealt with Junie, there's a good chance they're going to get a bunch of guys just like Junie next season. And does anyone really want to see that? I don't think so. For a while, you know, and part of this is, I understand the Ultimate Fighter is meant to be somewhat of a tournament too, and I've complained about this in other videos when it comes to UFC, but since Pride left, and of course Dream did one of these, but, you know, Pride used to do their Grand Prix, and they would do maybe about one a year, and they'd be different weight classes. It would, in my opinion, I would rather see the Ultimate Fighter be more like that, where you might have, you know, one weight class. Maybe you could do 3 weight classes and just make them, you know, 1-round fights apiece, and, you know, have the guys go along and maybe have another weight class that you could air on for WEC, one of the lighter weights. You could air on the internet, something like that, but something more along that, to where you were actually building up. You would be focused on, pretty much like they do now, where you focused on 2 guys, but you built up both guys. And even, you know, even though, you know, because with the production and everything, they already know pretty much who won, still build up both guys so that it seems important, and build up the fight to an extent, even if you have maybe 1 or 2 fights, and even if they're 1 or 2-round fights. To me, that might make the show a little bit more interesting than, let's bring all these guys together, let's put them in a house, let's bring in, you know, 2 UFC guys, and they're going to coach with the hope that, you know, they have this rivalry going and it sells their fight down the road, which I don't think has really worked the last, I would say maybe, you know, the last 2. You know, I mean, are you any more excited about seeing Mir and Nogueira after watching this season? You know, this is going to air right before, I guess, before the season finale, and I'm not going to be able to see the season finale, not that I probably would have watched it anyways. But, you know, are you any more excited about that? Are you any more excited of seeing the last fight that this was supposed to go to? I mean, it's just one of those things that just makes, it's just, I don't get. You know, one thing that might be good is if they took like a page from the IFL, probably the only thing they ever should take from the IFL. But when you bring in the coaches, bring in maybe like Dan Severn, or, you know, somebody like that, someone who is a guy that's not fighting anymore. Well, Severn's still fighting, but a guy that people would see more as a legend, and not a guy that, not 2 guys that you're trying to promote a fight for, and you're basically wasting time promoting this fight, unless you can get 2 guys that literally don't like each other on 2 different teams and having them go head to head. Because how many guys in the UFC truly do not like each other and are truly going to go like that? You know, I mean, that's just kind of the way I see it. But I would much rather see it be more like maybe a tournament, just a pure tournament, than what we get now. Because the reality aspect of it, I think, is getting a bit boring and a bit stale, and I think they need to change it up a bit. But like I said, you know, to me, they bring in these guys, and it's like, some of these guys are like, wow, is this really the best you could find to bring onto the show? And maybe it is. Maybe that is the best guys they could find. But, you know, I mean, it's no secret that in every weight class, for the most part, there are definitely guys outside the UFC that the UFC, you know, are not in the UFC for a variety of reasons, which, you know, I do think is a problem. But, you know, it's things like that. I would much rather see, you know, I understand you might not be able to get to the best young up-and-comers to be on the show, but you should be able to get a pretty good number of the best guys, up-and-comers, for whatever weight class or whatever you want to do, and I just don't think they do that. And I think the fact that, you know, once the Ultimate Fighter is over and they bring in these other new guys who are not in the Ultimate Fighter, and then when they do good against the guys that were in the Ultimate Fighter, I think it just hurts the Ultimate Fighter. What would help the Ultimate Fighter would be if, you know, you bring in these guys who were not in the Ultimate Fighter, they come in and you basically feed them to the Ultimate Fighter guys. Because, you know, that's one of the things, you know, one thing about boxing that hurts boxing a lot of times is they set up these fights where you definitely have a guy who's supposed to win the fight and it's basically just a fight to make a guy look good. And there's nothing wrong with that, and sometimes that's a good thing to do. But the problem comes from if you do like what boxing has done, which they try to hype, you know, they basically, you know, they try to hype the guy up a little bit more than what he is, or it becomes disingenuous and everyone pretty much knows what's going on, and then, or they, you know, everyone pretty much understands what's going on, and then the guy that was supposed to lose wins. Well, then, you know, often it doesn't translate into that guy becoming a big star, you know. And one thing UFC needs to do is, and it'll be interesting to see the next season how this plays out, because I think this next season will be interesting to see. But I understand you want to bring in guys with personality and that sort of thing. The problem with that is that's not always that's not always going to be your best fighters, and you have to kind of weigh that, because you look at, you know, you've definitely got some guys who are not marketable per se, and are not big money guys. They're not guys that are going to bring on a lot of money. But at the same time, you can't be like boxing and totally ignore those guys and say, okay, we can't have these guys actually fight for any of the major championships, even though they might be the best fighters, because they're not going to bring in the money. You know, UFC has to stay steps ahead of boxing. That's why I brought up before that I think they have to come up, you know, not rely on the boxing commissions, but instead come up with some way for, you know, as far as cutting of weight and that sort of thing, as far as the weight classes go, within their own, and saying, okay, we're going to fix this because this has been a problem in boxing, and it's somewhat a problem with MMA, but not as bad, I would say. But this has been a problem in boxing, and so we're going to fix it so we can stay ahead of boxing. And I think that if MMA can say, hey, look, we're not boxing, or UFC, I shouldn't say MMA, but UFC. If UFC says, hey, we're not boxing because we're going to give a guy like Machida title shot, and if he wins, he wins. And yes, he's not the most marketable guy in the world, but you know what? He's the best fighter, and we want the best fighter to hold the title, because then you fall, because we are better than boxing, and this is something boxing would not do. And I think the same thing would have to be said about the Ultimate Fighter, and that at some point you have to say, yes, this guy may not be, you know, this guy may be to use a wrestling term, this guy may be Lance Storm-like, where he's got the look, but he's not necessarily the most exciting guy in the world, but he's definitely one of the best guys in the world, and he definitely deserves a shot. And if you don't do that, then I do think that you're falling into that kind of trap that boxing often falls itself into, where, you know, at some point you do have to have the best guys, and at some point the best guys, because they are the best, fans eventually do get behind them. But if you make the mistake of, well, he's not marketable, so we're not going to support him as much as we should, then once he gets to that point to where you're going to have to, you know, you can't make as much money off of him as you probably could. So there, you know, that's one of the other things I don't like about the Ultimate Fighter. But mostly it just basically comes with, I wish we would see some guys in the Ultimate Fighter with a little better pedigree, I guess you would, is what I would say. Like I said, particularly since, you know, if you've ever seen Inside MMA, they show, you know, the smaller fight cards from around the world, from around the U.S. And you definitely see guys on there that go, wow, that guy looks like, he at least looks like he's pretty good. You're seeing highlights, so it's kind of hard to tell. But also with Sheerdog, because they show some of the, they stream some of the smaller fight cards as well. And you see guys that you go, wow, who haven't fought a lot, and you're like, wow, I wonder, he looks like he might have something. And if we can see that, you would think UFC could see that. And if they're not, and if they don't, and if they're just relying on guys who are saying, hey, I want to be in the Ultimate Fighter, here's who I am, and they're not out looking for guys, I think that's a problem. And sometimes I get that feeling that they're waiting for guys to come to them instead of going out and looking for guys. But that's just me. Like I said, that's just some of my problems with the Ultimate Fighter. I know they're somewhat minor. I mean, the show does do what it needs to do, though I've never been that impressed with it, and particularly over the last, I would say, I guess this season, I don't think the ratings have been all that wonderful and great. Not to get in the whole, pro wrestling versus MMA thing, but, UFC's kind of premier show, which is what the Ultimate Fighter is, should not be doing, less or the same ratings as ECW, or even, I won't say Impact as much, but definitely ECW, which is, I mean, that's WWE's, as far as they're concerned, sometimes it looks like, or who cares show. So, I think that's part of it. And like I said, I definitely think there's just a lot of problems I have with it, and that's the majority of it. It's just, the pedigree and that sort of things. And I'm sure a lot of people come on here and say I don't know what I'm talking about, and that's fine. It might just be me. I might just be one of the few people that there's just something about it that I just don't like, and it's all of those things wrapped into one, and then there's even more to it as much. I think some of it is definitely the reality show aspect of it. I'm not a big reality show fan. I think that's a lot of reality show TV is crash TV, and I think that even though reality shows still to an extent get good ratings, they're still not getting the massive ratings they once were. And of course, one of the reasons why you see so many reality shows, if you don't know, reality shows are very cheap to make, because there's a lot of, you're not having to pay writers and that sort of thing. There's a lot of things with a reality show that you don't have to pay for, and so they're cheaper to make sometimes than a regular television show. But and I'm not a big reality show fan, so that might be another reason why I don't like the Ultimate Fighter. Like I said, if it had more of a tournament feel to it, I would probably like it a lot better, and I think it would actually be a bit more successful too, because people like tournaments, and I think that's one reason why people like the Ultimate Fighter to an extent, because there is that tournament feel to it. But then you throw in the reality show aspect of it, and I'm just kind of like, I could care less. That, and I don't always feel like we're seeing the best possible guys we are. Sometimes I think we're just seeing marketable guys that they just throw on there and then don't necessarily wind up being great fighters, or have whatever. But and you do need characters, don't get me wrong, because the show's got to be entertaining. But sometimes I'm just like, man, is this really the best they could find? And that's not a diss to the guys, because I mean, they are out there fighting, but just that sort of thing. Anyways, I've rambled about this a lot longer than I thought I was going to, but anyways, that's it. I'm out. Later, and have a good one.